Hi weaving friends, welcome to another one of my videos. Today's going to be a little bit different. I wanted to try and make this kind of a little bit informal. This is a much requested class and there's a lot that could be said about this topic, so I wanted to try and make it as though you're coming over to my house and we're going to have a cuppa together and just chat about yarn. So often when I get an email from a student, I really wish that I could teleport them so that they could be here with me and we could just chat and I could show you things and it'd make life so much easier. But anyway, that's sort of my intention with today's video. So we're going to be talking about yarns, suitable heddles or reeds for using those yarns, what sort of projects you might want to use particular yarns for. And I thought the best way to do this was probably just to show you a heap of my own projects. Some of them are personal, some of them are from my weaving school, some of them from my Etsy patterns, but just to show you what sort of yarns I've used, what heddles I've used with them, and what you need to look out for or think about, because trying to choose your yarns as a new weaver can be very, very confusing. If this is a topic that particularly interests you, I'd like to refer you over to one of my online classes, and it's called What Do the Numbers Mean? And it's a more in-depth view of like what all of the actual numbers when you buy yarn, what the measurements mean and how you can use them and apply them to your own work. And that class also includes a couple of charts that are really handy. They're like knitting yarn conversion charts and weaving yarn conversion charts, so that you've got a visual reference of how you're going to use these yarns and what their best set is and all of that good information. So if that interests you, I'm going to put the link down below. There's going to be a bunch of links that I'm going to put down below, but I'm also going to write a blog post to go with this video that's going to have more links for you for the specific yarns that I talk about in this video and other useful information for you if you want to delve in a little bit further. If you're new here, I would love for you to subscribe to this channel. There are lots and lots and lots of weaving videos here, and I would love for you to subscribe and spend an afternoon with me going down the weaving rabbit hole. Also, if you like, comment on this video, share it with your friends, that is very helpful to me. Okay, so I've got my cup of tea ready to go, nice and hot in my very big mug. This is a design of my husband's. This is available in his online shop, so I'll put a link to that as well. He's got lots of other designs. He hand draws these designs. Pretty cool stuff. All right, let's get back to the weaving and we'll just dive right in. And this could be a lengthy chat, so I hope you can stay to the end and I hope that it's helpful for you. The first thing I want to address, this is one of my most asked questions with beginner weavers wondering about which yarns are appropriate, is what to use for warp. So I've mentioned before that there's a really simple and good test that you can do on the yarn that you intend to use as a warp. And it's just a simple snap test where you can grab a length of yarn that you think you might want to use and just wrap it around your fingers at either side and then just pull as a kind of quick snapping action. So this yarn is nowhere near snapping, so I know that if I use this as a warp yarn, it's probably going to work out pretty well. In comparison, I've got this piece of roving that is one part of it's very lightly spun, just as a single, which means it hasn't been plied with another yarn. And I can grab that as the wrap test as well. And when I snap it, it doesn't break. However, if I pull gently on this yarn, it drifts apart. And if you have a yarn that drifts apart in this way, it's going to be terrible for your warp yarn. Fine for weft, don't use it for warp. It'll give you such a headache. But there are exceptions to the rule. One of them is chenille. This is a rayon chenille. Now, I will do the snap test on this one. This was a piece of wool, by the way, the strong one. It's a light worsted weight wool. Okay, so now I've got my rayon chenille and I'm going to wrap it around my fingers and give it the snap test, and it snaps almost straight away, very easily. However, I have used this yarn successfully for warp. It doesn't drift apart. See if I try to kind of pull it apart. It won't pull apart, but in the snap test it'll fail every time. But I have found that if you have a good even tension on your warp, that is, that all of your warp threads are under the same or very similar tension, and you don't over tighten them, it's fine as warp. But it really depends on the yarn. So if you're a beginner weaver, don't warp with something like this chenille. Don't warp with something light and fluffy like this that's going to drift apart. Choose something that is absolutely going to give you the best chances of not having broken warp threads. The next thing I want to say about yarns for beginners is don't spend a lot of money on yarn for your first couple of projects. You can start spending more money and getting better yarns once you are more confident as a weaver. But if you've spent an awful lot of money on a beautiful skein of yarn and you're warping for the first or second time, you're probably going to be really stressed about making sure that everything works out really well because you've spent so much money on that yarn and you've already made that investment. So you're putting that stress on yourself. These yarns in the bowl here, these are all woolen, Australian wool knitting yarns. I get them directly from the mill and they come in really big balls. If anyone's interested, it's Bendigo Woolen Mills is where I get all of these. And they're really affordable, Australian made, which I love, come in lots of different colours, and they are strong. And I've used them so much that I know them very well. But they definitely don't break the budget, and there's a lot of things that you can do with just these basic woolen yarns. They also have cotton, and their cotton is really lovely as well. And that brings me to my next point, which is knitting yarns. Knitting yarns are awesome for new weavers for several reasons. Like I said, they come in lots of different colours. There are lots of different varieties. Some of them are blends of different fibres, some of them are just straight out fibres, some of them are acrylic, cotton, wool, alpaca, all kinds of things. I would be a little bit wary of alpaca for your first few projects, maybe use that later. Also avoid mohair. These are sticky yarns that are going to, when you try and open up your sheds, they're going to stick to each other and they're going to give you a headache and make the weaving experience not so much fun. Use the more challenging yarns later on if you want to. So knitting yarns are often, they come in a variety of thicknesses, but you can get them in this is Australian 8-ply, which is a light worsted, or DK weight, which is fantastic for first weaves because it's thick but it's not chunky at all, and you can make lovely things with it. Wool is also very forgiving. It has some elasticity, so it's easy to warp with because as long as you try to have an even tension across the width of your warp, you can wool really works with you when you go to tighten up the tension and try and get it right. Cotton is a bit tighter, so it's a little bit harder, and you'll have things like one shed might be a little bit looser than the other, but you don't get those problems with wool. So if you do like wool and if you have it accessible to you at a good price, I really recommend that to start with. Okay, so because we were just talking about wool, I'm going to start with a woolen item. This is a scarf that I wove many years ago now, but I still have it. And I used a light worsted wool for this and I hand dyed it. Someone is going to surely ask me about these labels. If you're interested in these cloth labels, I got mine from Fancy Weaver and they were really good. All right, so if I fold this out a little bit, I said that I hand dyed this. So what I did for this one is I started with this pink. It's a little bit variegated because I did hand dye it, and I dyed it so that I would have some subtle differences. You can just see that some bits are a little bit lighter than the others. And then for the weft, I dyed the same pink, but I alternated it with some green. So basically made pink and green stripes in a big hank of yarn. And then when you weave it, you get these interesting patterns. You can even dye yarns so that if you know the width of your piece, whatever it's going to be, you can measure so that you can have certain repeats of color. That's another thing to talk about, but I did say this video was going to be long. So anyway, I sort of like doing it a little bit randomly, because then you get all of these really interesting little stripes and dots of color throughout. So this one was just a plain weave, and with my light worsted yarn, Australian 8-ply, I used my 7.5 dent heddle. So another great thing about this woolen yarn that's so readily available is it's perfect for the heddle that comes with your loom, which is either a 7.5 or an 8 dent, depending on the make of your loom. So when you're starting out, you don't necessarily want to buy all of these extra heddles. These can be referred to as reeds or heddles. I'm just going to refer to them as heddles because it's what I'm accustomed to. And so the wool is an easy way to get started. The best way to check whether a yarn size is suitable for your heddle is to do a set test, and I have another video about that, and I also have a video explaining what set is. So have a look for the cards up on the screen somewhere, they should be there, and you can go to those if you don't understand what I mean by set. But that's how you can determine which size of yarn is going to be correct for your heddle. So just as an aside, I have a little of the same size of wool that I use for this. Obviously it's a different color, but if I just take a moment and thread that through a slot, and then I have a look by sort of moving it around and putting it up and down, that looks pretty good to me, because the yarn has enough space within this slot to move about, but it's not really loose in the slot, and it's not tight in the slot. So if it was tight in the slot, that would mean that every time I move this heddle up and down, it's going to be rubbing on this yarn. It's going to be stressing the yarn, and then you'll get fluffiness and you'll get broken warp threads. So that's one of the reasons that we find the correct set first. Another reason to find the correct set, well, let's have a look at this scarf. If you're going to wear a scarf, you usually want it to be soft, drapey, and comfortable to wear. If you use the wrong set, say I use a set that is too high for this yarn, then I'm going to get something that is too stiff, and it's not going to be pleasant to wear. So that's one of the reasons. And I actually have an example of a scarf that turned out a little bit too stiff. Okay, this is another one of my old ones, and I did an ombre dye, so like a dip dyeing. You can see it starts out purple and it fades to cream, and it's like that on both ends. It's quite pretty, but I used this cotton that I'm accustomed to using. Once again, it's an Australian 8-ply or a light worsted DK, and I used it with a 10 dent heddle. Okay, so the 10 dent heddle, which of course has narrower slots and holes than the 7.5. And I thought it would be fine. I was a little bit less experienced at that time. And it just, when it came off the loom, it was quite stiff, and I thought, that's fine, no worries, I'm just going to wet finish it and it'll come up all beautiful and soft like this one did. And after the wet finish, it was still stiff. So I know that you can't feel this, but I can tell you about the difference. They're both plain weave. This woolen one, when I look at the weave, it's slightly open, so when I look at the little squares or the interlacements of the plain weave where it's gone over and under, it's very slightly gappy. Not really gappy, but if I held it up to the sun, I'd be able to see through it a little bit. So it's got a bit of give, you know, it's got a little bit of stretch and movement, and that's something that helps to make it drapey. This one, the plain weave, well, it looks gorgeous because plain weave is gorgeous, of course, but it's just pretty tightly packed in. And that's the problem with this one. I used the heddle that was too small for it, and it packed the warps and the wefts too closely together, and I've ended up with a denser fabric than I intended. And therefore, this scarf is a little bit stiff. See how it kind of stands up, whereas the woolen one just collapses, you know. And so, yeah, it's stiff. It's not all that comfortable to wear, even though it was a soft cotton to start with. It's a lovely cotton that I use all the time. But yeah, it was too stiff for this scarf, and as a consequence, I don't wear it, which is a shame because it's quite pretty. While we're on the topic of hand-dyed wool, I just wanted to show you this one quickly. This is a poncho that I made some time ago, and I finished it off with this really cute little bauble trim. I like that. I used a heavier wool for this one, so I used an Australian 10 ply instead of an 8 ply, and which is more like an R in weight of yarn. And I also hand dyed it. So this is, I used a 7.5 dent heddle. So this fabric is a little bit denser, but because it's this lovely soft wool, it just means that it's a slightly heavier garment than, say, my lovely floppy scarf here with the slightly lighter wool. So still using the same heddle, and I also hand dyed this one. I don't remember exactly what I did for the warp, but what it looks like to me when I look at it is it looks like I did some very light pink stripes through the warp combined with purple. So purple and a little bit of pink, and purple and a little bit of pink, with this very busy hand-dyed yarn. So if I was using a hand-dyed yarn, what I really like to do is either use it for warp or use it for weft, because if I use the hand-dyed yarn for, and it's really variegated like this one, for both warp and weft, it can just end up a bit of a mess. Like the beauty of and the colours of the yarn can get a little bit lost in all of that intermingling. And you can also end up with sort of cross colour contamination, you know, say like a watercolour paint. If you combine too many colours, you end up with a bit of a muddy effect. So something similar can happen. So it's good to choose colours that, to combine solids with more brighter variegated yarns. To show you, just as a matter of interest, what a weft yarn like this might look like, I actually have a sample of it here. The very same yarn, had a little bit left over, and I've just wound it into a little skein so that you can see how it actually looks as a yarn. So if you can get a visual on this, I make a big skein. This is a mini skein, but I make a really big one on my umbrella swift. And then I lay it out after I've prepared it, and I paint it in sections. And so when it becomes dyed, you get all of these colors in different sections, and yeah, it's a very interesting way of dyeing, very pretty. Also, you get, when you use primaries like yellow, red and blue, though I normally use yellow, fuchsia and turquoise because I really like those shades of those particular colors. But what you get is where certain colors meet, so for example the yellow and the turquoise meet and it makes this gorgeous vibrant green. The yellow and the fuchsia meet, makes a lovely orange, and the blue, the turquoise and the fuchsia meet, it makes an awesome purple. So with just 3 colors you can get a lot of colors. Maybe I'll make a class on that sometime. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. But that's just a little interesting extra. Still on the topic of wool, I have here my famous garden path scarf. This is a version that I have in a fuchsia color, and it's a lighter wool than the other wools that I've shown you. So this is a fingering weight or an Australian 4-ply. So for this one, I use a 10 dent heddle. However, this is a sort of open, airy weave. You can probably see that there. I'm trying to show you the the airiness of it. So it's a little bit like a knitted lace, which is one thing that I really love about this scarf. This pattern's available in my Etsy shop, by the way. So this is made with the lighter yarn, but it's also a lighter weave. So this is a sort of weave that you can get away with a bit of experimentation. Just this morning I had someone message me and ask me about the pattern, if they could substitute another heddle for it. And I said yes, absolutely, because what could happen is you could end up with something a little more open than this weave, but it wouldn't be wrong because it's not a plain weave. So that's another thing in choosing your yarn, is if you're not doing a balanced plain weave, then you can play around with your yarns and your heddle sizes a little more. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment when I come to talking about twill. But I just wanted to show this as an example of not always having to follow a certain set for a certain yarn. Once again, this is my knitting wool, and I just love it. In winter, you will see this scarf around my neck most of the time. I don't even care if people see me wearing the same thing over and over because I just love it. I made it extra wide and extra long so that I can really rug myself up in it. And it's just perfect. And it's easy care, it's easy to wash, everything. You can call this section my cautionary tale on wool blends. Okay, a lot of wools, they come as blend, and they could be blended with cashmere, they could be blended with angora, with alpaca, with silk, with cotton. All right, silk in particular, I want to tell you to watch out for it. If it's blended with wool, it can be slippery and it can give different results to what you might expect. And I'm going to use this scarf as an example. So this has a bit of a story behind it. You might notice it's a little bit, well, quite beaten up because I actually gave it to my girls when they were a little bit younger, and they've had a really good time with it. I do believe I've seen them use it as horse ropes on each other. And I probably don't need to say anymore. But anyway, this was going to be a special one. I bought this merino silk sparkle yarn and baby alpaca. Okay, my idea was to use the baby alpaca for warp, and I hand dyed that in a purple, and the silk merino sparkle I knit it into a blank with my little knitting machine, and that took forever, as it does. And then I dyed it in a gradient. So the gradient is moving from red through to orange, yellow, green, different shades of green, into the blue, different blues, and then into purple. So I kind of wanted a rainbow gradient, which worked out fine. The dyeing went well, as it often does. And so I warped up with my baby alpaca, which, by the way, is one of the softest yarns you will ever feel. It is gorgeous. And it is around, it's a kind of light worsted weight, and the silk merino sparkle was the same weight. Okay, so I warped up with my baby alpaca. First thing I noticed was, as I already mentioned to you, the alpaca prevented me from getting nice open sheds. One of the things you can do if that happens to you is, well, there are a couple of things you can do. One thing is, when you open up the shed, use a pickup stick or something, you know, some sort of smooth stick, and put it in the shed to sort of clear out any threads that are sticking to each other. And the second thing is, I haven't done this myself, but I've heard lots of weavers do it, is to use like an anti-static spray or a hairspray or something like that. Give it a light spray just so it's not so likely to be staticky and clinging to it itself. Anyway, back to the story. So I warped up with the baby alpaca, and I was thinking this is going to be the best thing I've ever woven, and started weaving with my silk merino. The first thing I noticed was that a lot of my weft threads were showing more than I intended them to. Now, I was a pretty decent weaver by the time I wove this, so it was really disconcerting to have parts of the weft showing up, and I'm like, what on earth is going on there? No matter what I did, these little bits of weft kept showing up. I kept on weaving, and it happened throughout the whole piece. So here's your close-up so you can see what's happening. The warp is showing inconsistently rather than showing in a balanced way. So in some sections you can see the warp more, in some sections you can see the weft more. So warpy section there, wefty section there, warpy section there. And then the worst thing on the edges is it's got some of the warp threads showing. As I said, no matter what I did, so frustrating. So I stuck it out. I wove the rest of the scarf. Same thing happened over and over. You can see it all the way throughout, and it was very disappointing. Anyway, I did figure out eventually what had happened. The silk in the merino blend combined with the baby alpaca were too slippery on one another. If I'm weaving with wool weft and wool warp, then the wool has a way of clinging to itself in a nice way so that it all stays orderly. You weave a pick, you beat it, it stays there, right? Not so with this one. So I always caution people, and I have had so many messages, I cannot tell you how many, of people saying, I can't understand what's going on. My warp keeps showing through, especially at the edges. And I say, what yarn are you using? And they almost always say merino silk, or some sort of wool silk blend, or something silky combined with alpaca. So yeah, these things are slippery. They're soft, they're lofty, they're slippery, they're beautiful, but when they're combined, they're not always a lot of fun. So that's my cautionary tale. The next yarn I want to talk about is handspun. A lot of spinners become weavers, and they like to use their handspun in their garments, which is great. I used to spin quite a bit. I don't really get time for spinning now, but I have been looking lovingly at my spinning wheel recently. I miss it, so I might just have to make some time to do some spinning. Okay, so here's an example of some hand spun yarn. This is hand dyed once again. You might have figured out by now that I like to hand dye my yarns. And hand spun can absolutely be used and incorporated into your weaving, both in the warp and the weft, or you can combine commercial yarns. So as an example of a project that has used 100% hand spun yarn, and yes, I've made this a fairly small skinny scarf, because if you've ever spun your own fibre, you'll know that it does take quite a lot of time to get a certain amount of yarn. So this yarn for me was merino, and I dyed the fibre first, and then I fractal spun it, which is a style of spinning that makes all these colours come together in this awesome way. You can see there in the fringe how the colours are all twisted around each other, and I really like that effect. So I used the same yarn for warp and weft. Now I was saying before about being careful about using hand dyed for warp and weft. I wasn't so worried about this one because I had long colour repeats. So you can see here that I have some busy areas, but then they're sort of intermingled with these calmer, not so colourful areas. So it does depend on your hand dyed yarn too, as to how busy it is, how close together the repeats of colour are, and that sort of thing. I made this scarf more as a kind of experiment, something that I wanted to do, to be able to go, well, I've taken the fibre, I've dyed it, I've spun it, and I've woven it into a usable garment. And I'd definitely love to do more of that in the future. This one is an example of combining commercial yarn with a hand dyed yarn and hand spun. So for this one I used a fingering weight warp in a dyed black commercial yarn that is wool. And for the weft, I used my hand spun. It was a very colourful hand spun, as you can see, and it was sort of in rainbow colours as well, and spun in the same style as the other scarf that I showed you. But this time I combined it with just the plain black warp, and I really like the way it turned out. I used a pickup pattern. Don't ask me exactly what the pickup pattern is. It's some time since I did this. But I think I probably did this with 2 pickup sticks. So that's how the pattern looks on one side. And then on the other side, it's quite different, but also interesting. Actually, I'll turn it that way. So really colourful on the second side. And on the second side, you can see there are floats, there are weft floats on the back, and that highlights the hand spun yarn a little bit more. You can see more of the colours, and you can see more that it's a hand spun yarn, so it makes a feature of that. So it's a reversible scarf, and I think it's quite lovely. My only regret is that I didn't make it longer, because I really like long scarves. Here is another example of combining commercial yarn with your hand spun. This is, I used a fingering weight grey in the warp, and I also used stripes of hand spun. They're pretty subtle. The grey does tone them down a little bit, but you can see there are sort of stripes of purple and blue colours of some of my hand spun. And then I wove the same commercial grey weft across, and this would have been in my 10 dent reed. So that's another way to use hand spun. If you don't have all that much of it, you can put it in as little highlights or stripes, and it turns out quite lovely. This is a cowl that I made